The narrator described a slate sea yawning under a bruised sky as the tender neared Ilian Moor. Arthur Hale gripped the rail and watched waves shear like knives. Arthur said, "3 men gone," and silence louder than bells. The captain muttered, "Light was dark for days." Arthur noted the black lantern room, its eye unblinking. He felt the cliff breathe cold through his coat. Arthur said, "Facts first, then ghosts." Dr. Moira Kincaid checked her notebook and frowned. Moira said, "Barometer fell, then reports broke off. The gulls curved like torn paper above the reef. Spray salted every thought. The keepers' cottages sat neat and stern, doors shut like lips. The foghorn moaned a single wounded vowel. Arthur pictured a table half set, a chair scraped back. He caught the light of his own doubt. Arthur said, "We go up and we do not imagine." The island answered with wind that sounded almost human. The narrator described the landing platform as a scar cut into stone, slick with brine and shadow. Arthur said, "We log everything as we find it." He unhooked the chain and stepped into a silence that felt curated. Moira said, "Absence is a shape. We trace its edges." A battered crate sat split, labels gone to mush. The moorings were tight, knots clean, as if tied by careful hands. Arthur said, "No panic here." A gull pecked at a frayed rope and fled with a scream. Footprints blurred into a ragged smear that ended at spray. A bell rope knocked once like a question. Moira said, "Tide erased what the wind began." She drew a sketch of the landing and marked each iron ring. The cliff face held cold breath and old secrets. Arthur said, "We climb." Then the cottages, then the lamp. The island listened and did not disagree. The narrator described the spiral stair where rust kissed every bolt, and the air smelled of lamp oil and mildew. Arthur said, "If they left in haste, the tower will confess." His lantern coughed a tired glow. Moira said, "Records, then mechanism." She brushed dust from a ledger and opened to a damp page. Ink bled like bruises, yet dates held their ground. The wick trimmer lay clean. The oil can was capped and full. Arthur said, "Maintenance done," then an interruption. Wind worried at the panes and made a thin glassy whine. Moira said, "Barometer plunge at dusk, no entry after." She drew a breath and tucked the ledger away. The stair vibrated faintly as the waves hit. Arthur said, "They were orderly even in fear." The tower felt like a throat swallowing the storm. The narrator described the keeper's kitchen as a room paused mid-breath. A kettle waited on an iron range that had gone black. Arthur said, "Table setting for 2, not 3. He noted a chair skewed from the table, scraped as if by haste. Moira said, "Bread sliced, not eaten." A knife lay flat and dry. A clock on the mantel had stopped at an hour the storm remembered. Arthur said, "Coats missing from the pegs." The remaining oilskin hung like a question mark. Moira said, "Discipline and routine," then an abrupt demand. She lifted a tin mug and sniffed the ghost of tea. A draft crept under the door and rimmed the floor with chill. Arthur said, "Nothing stolen, nothing torn." The room held a calm that argued with fear. The silence pressed like a held breath that could not last. The narrator described the doorway to the yard where wind braided rain into cords. Arthur said, "One coat remains, so one man stayed or returned." He scanned the yard for order, turned wrong. Moira said, "Flag rope wound neat, no crash of panic." The path to the west landing showed faint scuffs, then drowned in grit. Arthur said, "If they went together, it was by choice or command." The foghorn's moan slid across their bones. Moira said, "We need names that fit the habits we see." She listed the keepers and their duties from memory. Arthur said, "Then we test the stories against the marks." Lightning shivered far out to sea, a thin, exhausted vein of light. The door thudded in its frame, like a heartbeat against wood. The island waited for the next question and the next wind. The narrator described the west landing as a wound carved into the cliff, its iron rail twisted like bone. Arthur said, "No storm alone bent that steel." He crouched and touched rust streaks that bled downward. Moira said, "Logs speak of gales, but this speaks louder." The ladder hung broken, last rungs eaten by surf. Water surged and hissed like a living thing. Arthur said, 3 men together, roped or not, would still fight. He scanned for rope traces, only to find smooth stone scrubbed clean. Moira said, "Nature writes, then erases." She noted each fracture in her book. The fog closed behind them like a lid on a box. The sea heaved, dragging foam over scars in the rock. Arthur said, "This place is too precise to be accident." His words sank with the tide's retreat. The narrator described the storage shed, its door ajar, hinges groaning like tired lungs. Arthur said, "Oil barrels full, lamp trimmed, nothing stolen." He kicked a coil of rope, neatly stowed. Moira said, "They did not prepare to leave." Dust lay unbroken, except where gulls had traced claws. Shelves lined with tins gleamed under his lantern's reach. Arthur said, "Provisions untouched. No hunger drove them." She lifted a logbook from a shelf, its ink smudged at the corner. Moira said, "One entry, unsigned, speaks of a great wave. Wind shuddered through planks, and salt sifted from the roof." Arthur said, "The sea leaves its mark, but not its words." He shut the door, and the shed shivered as though it exhaled. The narrator described the watchroom where glass rattled in its frame, and the sea clawed at stone. Arthur said, "This log ends mid-sentence." His finger traced faded ink. Moira said, "December 15th, winds at force 9. She looked up, eyes sharp. Arthur said, then silence. The storm outside swelled into a moan that filled the chamber. Dust swirled as if the air itself remembered movement. Arthur said, "If fear broke them, it left no trace but words unsaid." Moira said, "A storm that eats sound and leaves nothing but absence." The lantern flame fluttered, then steadied, mirroring their unease. The narrator described the tower stair vibrating with each wave strike, echoing like a heartbeat. Arthur said, "The keepers wrote storms often, but not like this." He carried the ledger under his arm. Moira said, "Something compelled them outward, not inward." She touched the railing, finding it slick with condensation. Arthur said, "If 3 men left, 1 coat remained, meaning haste or order." The stair shuddered again, dust falling like ash. Moira said, "Storms demand obedience, yet here obedience broke routine." Their steps climbed, each heavier than the last. The narrator described the cliff top where wind shredded clouds, exposing veins of moonlight. Arthur said, "We find their trail or accept none exists." He crouched, lantern low, scanning soil. Moira said, "Scuffs lead here, then vanish." Her pencil traced absent lines. The sea below erupted in pale spray. Arthur said, 3 men stood, then the sea claimed them. Yet no rope, no gear lay scattered. Moira said, "Absence repeats louder each time." The lighthouse loomed behind them, a blind sentinel. The fog thinned, then closed again, like curtains on a stage not yet done. Arthur said, "We are left with silence that shapes itself into questions." The narrator described the logbooks scattered on the desk, stained with damp rings. Arthur said they were men of duty, not dreamers. He flipped to an older entry where Thomas Marshall wrote of a storm that nearly crushed the lantern glass. Moira said, "Marshall feared the sea, yet feared breaking order more." The ink revealed steady handwriting, disciplined even under duress. Arthur said, "Routine is their shield, and when it broke, they vanished." A note described William MacArthur's temper, softened only when singing at night. Moira said, "Details breathe ghosts into silence." She copied their habits into her journal. Arthur said, "Lives leave shadows. We must trace them all." The room filled with the ghosts of voices, steady and vanishing in the same breath. The narrator described the bunk room where 3 narrow beds stood, each with an imprint pressed into the mattress. Arthur said, each man carried storms in different ways. He touched a pipe on the shelf, carved initials worn faint. Moira said, James Ducat, the principal keeper, wrote of missing his daughters. A folded letter lay unsent beneath the pillow. Arthur said, these were men anchored to land yet chained to sea. The walls bore scratches where boots had scraped in restless nights. Moira said, they left behind pieces of themselves too ordinary to fake. The lanterns swayed and cast long shadows across the bunks, each shadow seeming to breathe. The narrator described the cliff path where stones carried echoes of men walking home too late. Arthur said, MacArthur was said to fight storms like enemies. His hand grazed a jagged stone. Moira said, yet even fists cannot beat waves. She studied footprints carved faint into mud, hardened by salt. Arthur said, Ducat, calm, precise. Marshall, fearful, careful. MacArthur, rash, bold. Together, opposites. Moira said, their balance held until something broke it. Wind carried voices not present, a low hum resembling song. Arthur said, history leaves fragments, we build stories from echoes. The sea hurled spray, blotting the trail. The narrator described the chapel ruins on the island, stone walls broken but steadfast. Arthur said they prayed here once, keepers before them. He knelt, tracing a cross carved shallow into rock. Moira said, faith bends with storms, but does not always hold. Engle's stub rested in a crevice, wax hardened by cold. Arthur said, men cling to ritual when reason fails. The wind whispered through hollow windows like a psalm half forgotten. Moira said, if they sought solace, it left them unguarded. Lightning stitched the horizon, and thunder answered in delay. Arthur said, storms do not take prayer as payment. The narrator described the kitchen once more, but this time through memory unearthed from stories. Arthur said, neighbors spoke of Ducat's steady hands, never shaken. He lifted the tin mug again, heavy with absence. Moira said, Marshall feared dismissal, his caution often mocked. She smoothed a tablecloth crease, still faint. Arthur said, and MacArthur, hot-blooded, a fighter. He would not leave willingly. The 3 characters formed a triangle of routine, fractured by the unknown. Moira said, their lives do not fit Disappearance, yet here we stand in silence. The fire grate sat cold, ash untouched. Arthur said, we must accept silence as evidence until it speaks. The narrator described the records room where pages curled like old leaves. Arthur said, reports buried deeper than storms. He held a folder, stamped in fading ink. Moira said, official accounts silence more than they reveal. Dust rose as she opened a ledger. Arthur said, no mention of the last log's final words. The silence carried intent, as though designed. Moira said, truth hidden is as loud as any storm. Their lantern flame flickered, as if in protest. The air pressed close, thick with withheld knowledge. Arthur said, someone wants the mystery sealed. He shut the folder, the sound sharp as a verdict. The narrator described the storm cresting again, hammering the tower. Arthur said, the sea repeats itself like a warning. He leaned at the window, glass rattling. Moira said, storms erase, but they also mark. She pointed to foam carving grooves on rock. Arthur said, nature alone cannot explain absence. His reflection trembled in the pain. Moira said, fear writes in water, but men choose their steps. The tower shivered, echoing their doubt. Arthur said, if truth hides here, it hides with purpose. The storm roared louder, as though in argument. The narrator described the arrival of Edward Kane, a government inspector cloaked in calm authority. Kane said, you have seen enough. Records stand as truth. Arthur said, truth stands only when tested. Kane's eyes narrowed, controlled but unyielding. Moira said, withholding detail invites suspicion. Kane said, suspicion breeds madness. Order must prevail. His tone was firm, practiced. Arthur said, order cannot replace fact. The storm thunder punctuated his words. Kane stood as if stone, but silence betrayed calculation. The air thickened, charged with opposition. The narrator described Kane's warning, measured like scripture. Kane said, knowledge must be weighed against consequence. Arthur said, consequence belongs to truth ignored. Moira said, storms erase, but so do men with pens. Kane's eyes flicked to the files under Arthur's arm. Kane said, you will find no allies in digging further. His calm cracked briefly, steel beneath veneer. Arthur said, resistance tells me more than silence. The lantern hissed as if in agreement. Kane turned, his shadow stretching long on the wall. The silence after his exit roared louder than waves. The narrator described the cliff edge where wind tore words from lips. Arthur said, Kane fears something buried, not the storm. Moira said, secrets weigh heavier than waves. They stood against gale, coats snapping. Arthur said, if answers kill, then silence enslaves. Lightning tore sky open, thunder answering deep. Moira said, storms pass, but truths endure. Arthur said, then we climbed deeper, no matter the wall raised. Their lanterns flared, defying wind. The island growled, its voice both stone and sea. The narrator described the lighthouse parlor, where tension wrapped tighter than the storm. Arthur said, Kane hides, but someone among us twists deeper. Moira said, truth bends in hands we trusted. Their eyes turned toward Samuel Briggs, the assistant mariner who had ferried them across. Samuel said, I carried you here, not secrets. Yet his gaze shifted, uneasy. Arthur said, your silence weighs louder than denial. Moira said, he knows more than he offers. Samuel's fingers tapped against his lantern, rhythm betraying nerves. The wind rattled shutters like teeth, echoing the fracture between trust and suspicion. The narrator described Briggs leaning forward, words clipped like rope ends. Samuel said, some truths drown safer than they surface. Arthur said, fear is not proof. Moira said, fear is motive when silence serves power. Briggs shifted, shadows dancing across his face. He whispered of a night weeks before when strange lights pulsed offshore. Arthur said, you saw and stayed silent. Briggs said, to speak was to invite suspicion and madness. The storm bellowed, as though mocking restraint. Moira said, now silence feeds the storm more than truth ever could. The narrator described the tower stair where betrayal thickened the air. Arthur said, every secret delays truth. Briggs said, not all secrets belong to men alone. Moira said, explain or stand accused. Briggs' voice cracked as he confessed hearing chants below the cliff. Arthur said, rituals to calm or call storms? His lantern shook, flame quivering. Briggs said, I trusted Kane. He told me silence spared lives. Moira said, then Kane is not keeper of truth, but jailer of it. The stair groaned, carrying weight heavier than stone. The narrator described the common room again, air sharp with lightning. Kane returned, voice low, but iron-bound. Kane said enough. Secrets are walls against ruin. Arthur said, walls crumble when truth is stronger. Moira said, your silence feeds fear, not order. Kane's composure cracked, a flicker of anger showing. He said, you chase answers that burn nations if revealed. Arthur said, you overestimate silence, underestimate truth. Kane's hand pressed against the folder Arthur carried. Moira said, a man who grabs is a man who fears exposure. The lantern light quivered like judgment. The narrator described the cliff top, lightning cutting sky to bone. Arthur said, Briggs, your silence chained us, but truth frees. Briggs said, truth destroys more than silence. His voice broke, swallowed by thunder. Moira said, silence destroys slower but deeper. Kane stood apart, coat whipping, eyes unreadable. Arthur said, "You all fear truth because it unmasks you." Lightning cracked, showing faces pale with conviction. The sea howled, swallowing their words, but the storm carried them further. The narrator said, "On this island, betrayal walked hand in hand with silence." The narrator described the chamber beneath the lighthouse, where stones sweated with damp. Arthur said, "This place was built to hold more than oil and rope." He pried open a chest with rusted hinges. Moira said, "Ledgers older than this station itself." Her fingers traced dates, inked in fading script. Kane said, "You chase patterns into madness." Arthur said, "Madness is denying repetition written in fact." The candle bent in the draft, smoke rising like a warning. Moira whispered, "Ships lost, men gone, always near this island." Arthur said, "The keepers became another entry." Silence pressed like a closing door. The narrator described the stairwell, trembling with each blow of surf. Arthur said, "Every record circles back to this rock." He clutched the ledger tight. Moira said, "Storms erase, yet memory lingers in ink." Kane said, "Ink lies, waves speak truer than men." Arthur said, "Waves do not write ledgers." The wind roared down the shaft, scattering dust like ash. Moira said, "3 men did not leave by chance. Their steps followed command or compulsion." Kane's silence thickened, his jaw tight as stone. Arthur said, "Your silence is their gravestone." There groaned beneath them, echoing like grief. The narrator described the rooftop where lightning carved the sky into bone-white veins. Arthur said, "The storm is not nature alone." His voice battled the gale. Moira said, "Silence and ritual fuel it." Kane said, "Blasphemy to give storms intent." Briggs emerged pale and shaking, clutching the hatch. Briggs said, "I heard chanting the night they vanished." Arthur said, "Then men served the storm, not the sea." Lightning struck close, thunder splitting their words apart. Kane whispered, "Some truths unmake the seeker." Moira said, "Truth unspoken destroys more." Their faces glowed stark in each lightning flash. The narrator described the kitchen, storm shaking its timbers like bones. Arthur slammed the logbook onto the table. Arthur said, 3 men disciplined, yet undone by command." Moira said, "Order broken from above, not within." Kane said, "Better madness in silence than ruin in truth." Briggs trembled, eyes wide. Briggs said, "I saw them roped together, led into spray." Arthur said, "Silence makes accomplices of us all." Kane snarled, "Their loss preserved countless others." Moira said, "Sacrifice without choice is betrayal." The lantern hissed, flame bowing low, but refusing to die. The narrator described the cliff path where rain lashed like glass shards. Arthur shouted, "They were taken by order, not storm." Moira said, "Patterns betray intent, not chance." Kane said, "Intent destroys those who dig too far." Briggs cried, "I watched, powerless, as waves swallowed them." Arthur said, "Powerless men speak, not hide." Kane's silence cracked, eyes betraying dread. Lightning split sky wide, thunder rolling deep. Moira said, "Storms fade, secrets decay, but truth endures." The ground quivered as if the island itself stirred in protest. Their voices fought wind, desperate against silence. The narrator described the lantern room, its glass trembling as the storm pressed harder. Arthur said, "This is where it ends or begins again." He lit the lamp, flame blooming against dark. Moira said, "Light speaks even when men vanish." Kane said, "Light draws eyes best left blind." Briggs trembled, clutching the hatch. Arthur said, "Truth burns brighter than fear." The gale hammered, the sea rising like a beast. Moira said, "If they vanished, it was not without reason forced." Lightning cracked, flooding the room with stark, merciless light. The storm became a witness to their final stand. The narrator described the confrontation, words sharp as the storm outside. Arthur said, "You protect secrets, not lives." Cain said, "Secrets preserve nations." Moira said, "Preservation without truth is rot." Cain's voice cracked, "You do not grasp the weight of knowing." Briggs said, "I saw the keepers led like sacrifices." Arthur said, "And you followed in silence." Cain's face darkened, storm flashing across his eyes. Arthur said, "History is not built on silence, it is buried by it." The gale rattled the glass, as if demanding witness. The narrator described the breaking point as thunder split sky and glass. Cain shouted, "Silence is protection." Arthur said, "Silence is murder." Moira said, "The sea swallows men, but it does not order them to march." Briggs collapsed to his knees, weeping. He cried, "I let them walk to their end." Arthur said, "Your silence chained them." Cain's hand hovered near his coat as though clutching unseen weight. Moira said, "Confession does not end storms, but it ends denial." The lamp flame flickered dangerously, caught between survival and extinction. The narrator described the moment when the storm's roar dimmed, replaced by silence deeper than sea. Cain said, "The truth unravels more than it binds." Arthur said, "Then let it unravel." Moira whispered, "Silence already claimed 3 men. It cannot claim more." Cain's shoulders sagged, defiance cracking. Briggs sobbed, "I betrayed them by watching." Arthur said, "You betray them only if you stay silent still." The lamp steadied, its flame casting calm amid chaos. Lightning arced once more, but thunder lagged, subdued. The island seemed to hold breath, waiting for verdict. The narrator described the dawn breaking, fog rolling away like retreating curtains. Arthur said, "Truth remains unfinished, but silence is broken." Moira said, "Some mysteries linger, but light carries their weight." Briggs whispered, "I will speak of what I saw." Cain stood apart, silent, shadowed by choice. The sea glimmered calm, yet its depths hid secrets untouched. Arthur said, "Not all storms end with calm. Some leave questions as wreckage." The narrator concluded, "The Flannan Isles kept its mystery, half spoken, half buried, leaving men to wonder if truth belongs to light or to silence."